Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Bruce Gordon, who is Titus Street Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Yale Divinity School. Professor Gordon's research and teaching focus on European religious cultures of the late medieval and early modern periods, with a particular interest in the Reformation and its reception. His book, John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, is one of the defining works of the Reformation. He has also edited books and written widely on early modern history, biblical culture, Reformation devotion and spirituality, and the place of the dead in pre-modern culture. Today we'll talk with Professor Gordon about his forthcoming book on Huldrych, Zwingli, and the early Reformation. Welcome, Professor Gordon.
Great pleasure to be here.
So let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Right. Well, this is a book I've long wanted to get to. Huldrych Zwingli is a fascinating character of the early Reformation, very much an enigma. He comes out of a very humble background, born in a mountain valley, goes to be educated. He's a prodigious young youth and student who becomes a priest and then ends up in the city of Zurich. He's almost a complete a contemporary of Martin Luther. He's born in 1484 and lives till 1531. But where he really makes his name is as a preacher who accompanies the Swiss mercenary troops into Italy, and he experiences the horrors of war and battle firsthand. And that experience is very much a religious conversion for him, and leads to an idea that war, mercenary service, which is so central to the Swiss in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, is a great offense to God, and that they are being punished for this. So the enigma really lies in the fact that he emerges as this major figure, opposing mercenary service, the corruption and all that flows from it. But then he ends his life in 1531 dying on a battlefield. A battle in which he was involved in an aggressive attempt to spread the Reformation to Catholic areas. So he is this person who, on the one hand, espoused peace and absence from war, and on the other, dies in a most violent way, which makes him unique amongst the reformers.
Right, right. So, help us understand what the Reformation is.
Yes. Reformation is this movement that emerges in the early 16th century, focused very much on Martin Luther, whose 500th anniversary of the 95 Theses was marked last year. Luther protests against what he sees the abuses of the Catholic Church. And that protest, which it was with the famous 95 Theses, slowly evolves into a completely different vision of what the Church should be. Luther argues against the main ideas of Catholicism in the medieval period, to argue that faith alone is what saves a Christian, that Scripture alone is the authority for the Church, and that one is saved only by the gracious gift of God. So therefore, he emphasizes this immediate experience of faith and of the relationship of the individual to God over against the hierarchical church, the sacramental system of the church, the priestly order of the church, and that inspires a whole movement, which is often rooted in resentment against the church. But Luther is a master of the printing press, which has now entered into an age of maturity, and his message is spread across Europe. And that really is the sort of essence of the Reformation. And Zwingli is a contemporary and espouses many of the similar ideas, but it really begins with Luther.
Okay, so of course many people have heard of Luther, Zwingli not so much. So how did you, what led you to write the book, and you know, why is it that you think he's not as well known as Luther, given that they're contemporaries?
Sure. My own experience started many years ago when I went to Switzerland as a graduate student. I intended to work on a very different project. But while I was there and in the archives, it emerged to me that the most fascinating story was actually the story of Zwingli and the emergence of the Reformation in Zurich, where I was, and Basel, Bern, the other Swiss cities. And I became fascinated by this. And I was very much influenced, as I think many of us are, by several books. One historian, a man named George Potter, who wrote this life of Zwingli in the 1970s that inspired me to look more deeply into this character. And it's true, as you say, Zwingli is the lesser known of the most preeminent reformers, often in the shadow of Luther, his contemporary, and then of the successor figure, John Calvin. Zwingli is sometimes referred to as the third reformer, and he's the one that we know least about. There tends to be a few set ideas that are always said about him.
Which are what? That
he was the sort of disciple of the great humanist Erasmus, that he espoused a kind of rational Christianity, and that most famously, his debate with Martin Luther over the nature of the Lord's Supper, that Zwingli advocated a position that the Lord's Supper is only a memorial of the Last Supper of Christ. It is not, as both the Catholics, the Lutherans would argue, a sacrament in which Christ is really present. It's a theological debate, but Luther and Zwingli divided fiercely on this. And so Zwingli, if he's remembered, is very much thought as Luther's opponent in that debate. But there's been very, very little work done over the last couple of decades on Zwingli. He has been something of the forgotten figure.
And why is that, do you think?
I think because he's so much he is in many ways the founder of what's referred to as the Reformed tradition, which will become Calvinism, will become Puritanism. It becomes so crucial to transatlantic Christianity, and is still, of course, widespread throughout the world with the growth of Christian and Reformed communities in Asia and Africa. Zwingli is really the first figure in this, but because so many of his ideas were taken over by Calvin and further developed into future generations, that figure has been somewhat overshadowed. We tend to think of Reformed Christianity as Calvin and Calvinism, and Zwingli has somewhat disappeared in that.
So in writing the book, did you come upon any new material that helped you write the book?
Yeah, I think the area that has been most fruitful for me in terms of new material is something that is not unknown but very much unmined, and that has been his extensive collection of letters, none of which have been translated into English. So you're reading them in Latin and you're reading them in the German of the 16th century, which is a distinctively Swiss German. So they're not easily accessible, but there's a large body of this correspondence, and what I have found in working through his letters, a very different portrait of the figure emerges.
So tell us about it.
Well, he's no longer seen simply as this kind of sort of rather stern moralist and scholar of the Bible, but this person who had a deep pastoral sense, who was deeply involved in a whole range of political questions, who was extraordinarily active in developing networks across Swiss lands and across Germany, and he spent a great deal of time. We know from accounts of his life that he would write letters late into the night, and that body of letters tells us about the way in which he understood things like friendship, his relationship with people who had similar ideas, his more polemical works against opponents. But he often talks about his family, he often talks about himself, and that's something we don't get by just attention to the theological tracts or the other works. Much more, as I experienced with working on Calvin, for the biography I did of him, the letters really bring out the person.
Sure. So who are some of the people that he wrote to?
Some of the people that he wrote to, well, of course, he wrote to Erasmus. That was a slightly ill-fated relationship. He was desperate as a young priest and a young humanist to have Erasmus's approval. And he worked through various friends to have access to Erasmus, even to visit him at one point. But Erasmus was the great figure, and to have an exchange of letters with Erasmus was the highest sort of accolade you could achieve as a young, aspiring scholar. But then in the end, Erasmus turns on Zwingli when Zwingli starts to adopt the more sort of Reformation ideas similar to Luther. So Erasmus is an early correspondent. He writes to his cousins. He writes to, there is a figure in Basel named Johannes Ecolampadius, who was one of the great scholars, another even more forgotten figure. But Zwingli has a close relationship with him. He's writing, he writing to figures who are spread across the German cities, who are become closely connected to him through this bond of friendship. Friendship is a very important idea for Zwingli, and letter writing for him was an expression of the bond between certain people, and that bond was not just spiritual, but it was one of almost familial And that's what you see in this correspondence. Many of the figures are completely forgotten and unknown, but Zwingli cultivated these relationships, and you see in return that he was frequently being asked for advice. One of the things, he was almost a kind of agony aunt of the Reformation. He's constantly being solicited for advice on a whole range of questions, and that his attempts to answer these often very practical issues bring out, I think, concerns that we don't find in any of his other writings.
So what a wonderful experience that must have been for you to be able to read his letters.
Yes, it was.
Was there anything that in reading that really surprised you, or something that you completely did not expect to find?
One way that I was completely surprised is that in his own writings, Zwingli doesn't often talk about himself. If you look at Luther, Luther's writings are full of his own experiences. You get very much a picture of this man who loved to drink beer, who loved his family, who thought about the world very much in terms of his own experiences. So Luther's very present in his writings. Zwingli has very little about it. We know very little about his conversion experience. Whole parts of his early life we know nothing of because he chose never to write about them. But what the letters do is help us to fill in a lot of the gaps. And I think the fact that people have not really looked at them has meant that we've seen him as this slightly one-dimensional figure. What surprises me, he talks about his love of music. He talks about his love of laughter. He often will share a joke. Which may not seem to us to be hilariously funny, but it shows that he had a real sense of humor.
Sure.
He talks about, as I say, about friendship, but he talks about his own experiences, and it's through the letters that, as I say, he really comes to life in a way that I think people have not really appreciated
Right,
before.
he comes across as a human being.
He does.
Yes,
he does.
yeah.
His own anger, a whole range of emotions that we don't associate with these reformers are very much there in his life. He talks about, he tells a story at one point where there was an attempt to abduct him from his house, but from his opponents, by his opponents. They came to the door pretending to be a messenger, and only by the work of one of Zwingli's domestic staff did they recognize that these people were actually there to try to take Zwingli as a hostage. He was constantly threatened by violence. There was graffiti on the walls. He was a highly controversial figure.
So what went wrong, basically, toward the end?
What went wrong was that Zwingli had this idea that the Swiss were an elect people, that God, like the ancient Israelites, God had chosen the Swiss. He was a deep patriot, and he believed that the Swiss people, these mountain people, rustic, that were not aristocrats, they had no king. They had this tradition of, vaguely speaking, democracy, where communities would decide from. These, for him, were the great virtues of his own people, and he believed that because God had chosen them, because they were the elect, that the true religion would naturally spread quickly, that they would embrace this, that they would throw off superstition, they would throw off the priestly class of the old medieval church. But he was desperately disappointed.
Because they did not.
They didn't, and the powerful Catholic forces remained within Swiss lands who were opposing him and sought his own execution and sought to crush what was happening in the city of Zurich. And that moved Zwingli increasingly to an idea that the gospel was going to have to be spread by force.
Which was quite a turn in his thinking from where he had started out. So talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I think this has been for me one of the chief challenges in writing this book, is to see, it's a relatively short period. He arrives in the city of Zurich in 1519 as a Catholic priest, and just over 12 years later, he's dead.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's really only from 1519 to 1531. Luther's story spreads out over decades. Calvin's story spreads out over decades. Zwingli's story is actually a very short and incredibly intense period. And it's also a time of enormous conflict. And it's that, I think it's, as we spoke about before, it was that sense that the forces arrayed against him of the Catholic Church were so strong that he moved towards this idea that if the people were to be liberated, that the temporal authorities were going to have to draw the sword and to engage in what we would see as a kind of form of religious coercion, force people into allowing the gospel to be preached. And you can see in this period of 1525, 26, Zwingli becoming more aggressive and thinking about ways in which the Reformation is going to have to be spread by force.
So in his letters, you can see it coming, where he's becoming, you know, more and more embracing the violence that he had once shunned.
Yes.
Did he ever express any doubt in his letters about wanting to use violence to have things turn more?
Yes, I mean, that's a really interesting point. He saw himself, as Luther did, as a prophet who'd been chosen by God. Zwingli had a strong sense of his own prophetic calling. He knew that there were many who opposed him, even in the city of Zurich, where he was. He was never a completely dominant figure. He was an extraordinarily controversial one, and at many points he thought he was going to be thrown out of the city. He was going to be a prophet who was not honored in his own land. He was going to, so he knew that he was in a kind of life and death struggle through the whole time that he was there. But he, as far as I can see, he never lost faith or never lost his vision that something divine was taking place, that he had been called to this prophetic renewal of the church, but also a prophetic renewal of his country, that the two were seen together. I don't think he ever lost that doubt, and I think he regretted that it led to war. There's no doubt about that. But he believed in the end he had to embrace it. And so he rides out from the city of Zurich in 1531 in October, armed, and enters into a conflict. It was a bit of a botched battle. But in fact, in the middle of the night, he's struck down and killed. But he's wearing armor. He simply had embraced the idea of a military expansion of this. And I've not found any sense. I can trace the development of it, but I don't see any notion of a kind of self-doubt about it. I think he was highly convicted that this was what he had to do.
Very interesting. So ultimately, what do you think Zwingli's legacy is, or should be?
Yes. I mean, although he has been this relatively overshadowed figure, I think, and what I hope to show, is that many of the core arguments about the Reformation emerge in these early years when Zwingli is the preeminent figure amongst the Reformed Church. This is debate with the so-called Anabaptists about whether there should be the church should be in a relationship with temporal authority or whether the two should be separated. It's a debate about sacraments. Zwingli is in many ways the initiator of what we would call covenantal theology, that there is a covenant between God and God's people. That idea becomes incredibly powerful for Calvinism, for Puritanism, and beyond, and remains in our world still an idea that is shared by many. So his legacy, although people wouldn't know to attribute it to him, is many of the key ideas that will form later the Calvinism, Puritanism, and a whole sort of school of Protestant thought, which in its many, many different forms. But those key ideas really take shape in the early 1520s when he is the major figure.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you very much.
Okay, for more information about Professor Gordon and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.